Jarvis-Shean, and through a series of influential events over several years, she took a turn from a bachelor's degree of history from Harvard University to pursue a degree in international agricultural development at UC Davis. She continued her pursuit of agricultural training through a PhD program in horticulture and agronomy at UC Davis. And in 2014, upon completion, she joined UC Cooperative Extension as the Orchard Systems Advisor. Today, her program works with orchard crops, primarily almonds, pistachios, prunes, and walnuts. And she has kindly joined me on several farm calls to organic orchards in our area and has been working to support the more diverse small-scale fruit orchards. We're really lucky to have her expertise and dedication to agriculture in our county and to have her here with us today. So thanks, Katherine, for taking some time to talk with us about nutrient management in orchards.
Sure, I'm happy to do it. All right, so as Margaret introduced, I'm the Orchard Systems Advisor for Yolo, Solano, and Sacramento County, which encompasses about 120,000 acres of tree crops at this point, but the vast majority of that being in almonds, pistachios, prunes, and walnuts, and the vast majority of that being conventional. So I want to be upfront about that's most of my point of reference, even though I got into agriculture working on organic farms. That's most of where I'm coming from today. But I was lucky enough to have a little bit of time with Andrew Brait last week from Full Belly Farms to talk through their nutrient management approach and some things to talk about today. And we got into this really interesting discussion, in conventional agriculture. I think we often, there's often a critique that we get stuck in this reductionist approach of just honing in on the few things that we really need and meeting those needs and forgetting about the rest of it. And I think that's, often a fair critique, as opposed to looking at the whole system and trying to get the whole system to work together. But today I'm hoping to sort of meet somewhere in the middle. We're going to be talking about the nutrients that the trees use and need to stay healthy. But I don't mean to prescribe any one approach and how to meet those needs. I know that I need about 2,000 calories per day to meet my energy needs, but that doesn't mean I should just chug 8 bottles of Coca-Cola and call it good and not eat anything else or care in any way about how I'm meeting those energy needs. So I'm gonna have some numbers and concepts focusing in on the nutrient needs, and then we're gonna talk towards the second half together about ways to meet those needs. So I just said that. Okay. So a good fertility program is based on thinking about what is removed in terms of nutrients from your system with the crop that you're pulling off. And so trying to avoid getting into a habit of just doing what you've always done in the past or what you may have inherited from someone else who has worked in this before you. And we're monitoring long-term trends with annual tissue samples and also watching for symptoms of problems in the tissue that we can see. Some occasional soil sampling may be worthwhile, especially thinking about soil chemistry, particularly pH, to watch how that changes micronutrient availability. And knowing that yield is already affected by the time you see symptoms in the leaves of your crop. So to the extent possible, sampling the leaves to stay ahead of getting to the point that low nutrients impacts your yield. So there's plenty of different essential nutrients, as you guys probably are aware, for plants. What I'm going to focus in on today is nitrogen, potassium, zinc, and boron. The first 3, what happens when we don't have enough of it, which is more often the problem. And the last one, what happens when we have too much of it, which is a problem in the Cache Creek watershed. Okay, so let's talk first about what nitrogen is used for. So a big draw of nitrogen is in the pits or the seeds of your fruit, the protein, the nitrogen that goes into protein in those. Nitrogen is used for amino acids, constructing DNA. It's a part of hormones. It's a part of chlorophyll, and it's a part of defense compounds. So to keep all of these works moving within the plant, to keep that chlorophyll at a healthy level so that you get good photosynthesis, and to keep our defenses up in a natural way against fungal pathogens. These are all good reasons to watch our nitrogen and meet those needs. When we have nitrogen deficiency, when it's a mild deficiency, you'll often see just a lack of growth, not quite as much growth as you would expect. Smaller leaves, pale green leaves, often with a reddish tinge, which you can see in these photos here. An interesting thing about, so different nutrients, some are mobile within the plant. So the plant can move it from some tissue that has a lot of it into tissue that needs it more. And some is immobile. So nitrogen is one of the mobile nutrients. And so that's why we generally see a fairly uniform yellowing of the canopy when nitrogen is low, because the plant is trying to move it all around to equalize it throughout the canopy. But we do see that it shows, so we see this deficiency in both old leaves and new leaves. When things get worse from there, just from a yellowish green, we can decline into seeing these red spots and a real, like, much more yellow than yellow-green sort of color. So that's when we're on the deficient side. When we're on the excessive side, which happens, I think, a lot more probably in conventional systems, but we do want to avoid this because excessive nitrogen can give us problems with the color and appearance of our fresh fruit, which you can see here in this photo, and poorer shelf life because we don't have those. The fruit are just sort of too fat with nitrogen and aren't great at defending against pathogens. So also when we have excess nitrogen, we have excess shoot growth, which increases our summer pruning, can shade out lower limbs, can shade the fruit, which is part of the fruit coloring process problem. And from a state perspective and regulatory perspective, that also means nitrogen can get into our groundwater, which is where a lot of these nitrogen regulations have come from in the last couple of years. So when we think about how nitrogen is taken up into the plant, there's two basic forms of nitrogen in the soil at the point at which it gets into the roots, right? So there's nitrogen can be in lots of different molecules in your soil, but the kinds that are absorbed by the roots are ammonium or nitrate. So ammonium, to get taken up into the roots, it has to be turned into amino acids shortly thereafter, otherwise it'll be toxic to the plant. Nitrate has to be actively transported through transporters in the root system. And so I bring this up, this energy use, because the tree has to use energy to do this. And so when too much nitrogen is provided at once, or just generally too much nitrogen in the system, the tree's not going to take up a lot more than it needs. So this is where we get to the point of having problems with excess nitrogen in our system, in our soils, and why it leaches out. So both of these processes require energy and are highly regulated. And there's lots of different forms of nitrogen in the soil. There's soil organic matter, other forms, but it's everything eventually to be taken up by the plant turns into ammonium or nitrate. Ammonium is positively charged, and so it sticks in the soil. It sticks to the cation exchange complex, the sort of clays and that sort of thing in the soil. Whereas nitrate, being negatively charged, easily leaches out of the soil, does not stick in the soil very easily. So that's where our big concern is with our nitrogen management, in addition to just making sure that you get enough from various sources in an organic system, is making sure that there's not too much at once that turns into nitrate and leaches out of the system and into our groundwater. So generally, when we talk about nitrogen, we talk about this 4 R's approach of applying at the right rate, the right time, the right place, and using the right source, or I should say sources. And I think sources is especially true in organic systems. So when I say the right rate, what we're talking about is matching the supply with tree demand. Remembering that this nitrogen uptake costs the tree energy, and so the tree is going to minimize nitrogen uptake once that demand is met. And remembering that our supply is, there's lots of different sources of this supply. So we have our commercial fertilizer, we have organic sources of nitrogen, be they cover crop and or compost, or maybe even animals you have in your system, grazing animals, and then there's nitrate in our groundwater as well. So this is a walnut tree, but the basics still hold, that you have, your inputs is cover crop, manures, compost, nitrate in your irrigation water, if you're pumping from groundwater, commercial fertilizer, and we want that input to be on balance with what we're drawing off, because otherwise it's very susceptible to being lost from the system. All right, so that's our right rate. So that's looking at the big picture of what's harvested and what's used for tree growth, and matching what we're applying or inputting in various formats to match that demand. So then timing is thinking about the timing of that demand, matching what we're applying or what's becoming available, if we're thinking in terms of soil organic matter turnover, nitrogen in organic forms, mineralizing. Matching that availability of nitrogen with the tree demand. Remembering that, like nitrate especially, has to go through transporters, and so that can create a bottleneck, and trying to get more nitrogen in through that bottleneck is not generally effective. All right, our right place is delivering the nitrogen to the actively growing roots. So we'll need to think about where we have most of our roots to target that. And this is really about thinking that, ammonium somewhat, but certainly nitrate moves with water, with our irrigation water. And so when we're irrigating, trying to keep that water where the root zone is, so we're not flushing nitrate out of the groundwater, into the groundwater. So minimizing our movement of nitrogen below the root zone. Our right sources, this is really probably the trickiest part and the most unique, the part that varies the most from system to system. What we're targeting is maximizing the uptake, minimizing the movement below the root zone. And so there's, this will really depend on what your inputs are, what's available to you, what your irrigation system is, how you can apply the fertilizer that you're applying. But just always keeping that in mind when you're picking your source of nitrogen, that you want it to be staying in the root zone as long as possible during the growing season so it can be taken up. All right, so let's see, let me skip through this. All right, so let's talk about actually applying these principles. So when we talk about right rate, a lot of my examples are going to be in peach and nectarine, because that's where much more of the research has been done in terms of these numbers. But most of them are fairly applicable for the rest of stone fruit. The numbers, that is. So when we look at trying to figure out what our right rate is, say for a peach orchard, we're looking at our yield, the big picture, the yield we're anticipating at the end of the season, and knowing that 2.7 pounds of nitrogen are removed from that orchard with every ton of fruit that you harvest. And knowing that there's 19 pounds of nitrogen that goes in every year to growing the tree. On top of that, there's some nitrogen that's used in your leaves, in prunings that you cut off of the tree and then leave in the orchard. So we assume that most of that just keeps circulating in the system. So even though that's a big user of nitrogen, about 60 pounds, we assume that 90% of that, let's say, will be recycled. So you only need to backfill 10% of that, and let's call that 9 pounds. The other trick here is that not every little bit of nitrogen that you try to add into your system is going to make it up into the tree where it needs, to meet the tree needs. So we talk about targeting a nitrogen use efficiency of 70%. Knowing that not every bit of nitrogen is going to get up in the tree, we're shooting for 70% of it getting up into the tree. And so we apply enough nitrogen to meet the tree needs, knowing that there's going to be some of that loss from the system. All right, so how does all this math pull together? So let's say that you pull 6 tons of fruit off of your orchard. Then you need the per ton number here, 2.69 times 6 tons. Then plus 19 pounds for the perennial growth, which is about that amount regardless of how much fruit you harvest. And then 9 pounds for the leaves and the pruning, which again is about that amount regardless of how much fruit you harvest. And then we divide by 0.7. So that's how we build in that efficiency factor. So just the first part of the math before that division gets you to, there's 44 pounds of nitrogen used for every 6 tons of yield. And then when you get to how much you want to put into the system with that 70% efficiency factor, that gets us up to 63 pounds. When we talk about some other fruit crops, and I'm sorry, this is now in 1,000 pounds instead of tons. So 2,000 pounds per ton. Apples is less than peaches, apricots in the same ballpark, pears a little less, plums a little less as well. And cherries we see actually have more demand than peaches because each of these numbers you would multiply by 2 to get to the tons to compare with peaches. And this gets back to what we were talking about in the beginning, or I was talking about, of what is this nitrogen being used for? Because a lot of this nitrogen is in the pits or the seeds. And so, if you think about cherries having a pretty high pit to fleshy fruit ratio, there's a lot more nitrogen being pulled off of an orchard in a ton of cherries than in a ton of apples, which just have little pips. So when we were getting started, some folks talked about having, it sounds like all of you or most of you have a very mixed system. So, looking at these numbers, keeping them in mind, and then you just sort of have to target an average of that or overshoot that average a little bit to make sure that everyone is getting their needs met. We can talk about that more in the Q&A discussion time. So right time, we know from research in peaches that the first month of growth is drawing nitrogen from the perennial tissue, from the trunks and the scaffolds and that sort of stuff. It's not drawing nitrogen from the soil. And that's important because any nitrogen that you put on in that time or that becomes available in that time is not going to be taken up by the tree. After that, it's a fairly steady uptake over the course of the growing season. So we've seen this too with other tree crops. So I would expect this to also be true for the other stone fruit. The earlier harvest of apricots and cherries, they're probably drawing actually more out of those reserves because it's very hard to take up the needs of those crops just in that first, March, April, May timeframe. So there's probably some backfilling that's happening during the growing season. So that's our right time. So we're knowing that no nitrogen is used from the soil in that first month of the tree growth. And after that, we're looking to target an even uptake over the course of the growing season. Okay, so right place is really thinking about where the roots are in your orchard. And this varies some by the way that you irrigate. It varies some with your soil texture. But for the most part, in most systems, the roots are in the first foot to 2 feet of the soil, even in orchard crops. And the reasoning for this, I mean, that's often where the nutrients are most available. It's where the water is often most available, but also the trees' roots need some somewhat warm temperatures to grow, and they need oxygen to grow. So the deeper you get into the soil, the less oxygen in it is, the colder it is. So there's a lot of reasons why the vast majority of the roots are in those top 2 to 3 feet. Certainly you can find roots deeper than that. And if you're on a dry farming system, or if you flood irrigate maybe 2 to 3 times a season, you might have slightly deeper root systems, but that's still where the vast majority of the roots are going to be. Okay, the other thing with our nitrogen management is thinking about leaf sampling, and this is true for nutrient management in general. You know, we have this idea of critical values, a zone in which the leaves can tell us nitrogen or whatever other nutrient is adequate if we sample the leaves, and a zone in which the leaves can tell us you're not getting enough of that nutrient, you need to apply more, or change the other R's, maybe not apply more, but change your timing, change your irrigation practice to keep that nitrogen nutrient around. And these leaf samples will tell us when the trees are, when we're overshooting, when the trees are too fat with this nutrient, and we might be seeing some problems as a result of that, or we're certainly providing inputs that we don't need to. So we do our leaf sampling in late June or July, you know, sample by variety and by block, and keeping weaker areas separate from strong areas so that you can diagnose where you have problems. We're looking at 60 to 100 leaves. If you treated with foliar zinc, that won't be able to tell you then if you have a zinc deficiency inside that leaf because there's too much on the outside. And if you're putting on a nitrogen foliar spray, you want to wait at least a week before you sample. So I know a lot of you talked about having mixed systems, so this might not very easily translate to that. So I'd be happy to talk about that when we get into Q&A. So yeah, so the lab will tell you, or you can look up for yourself what these ranges of deficient, adequate, and excessive are. I'm realizing we spent a lot of time talking, so I'm going to kind of jam through here to potassium. Okay, so why do we need potassium? Why do trees need potassium? It's very important as a signaling molecule. It signals stomata underneath the leaves to open and close, so it's important for water stress management in that context. It signals cell expansion, so it's important for fruit size and shoot growth. It helps sugars move around the tree. It activates enzymes and is beneficial for disease resistance. When we don't have enough potassium, what we usually see is this leaf curl, this curling in of the leaves here on the edges. And this really manifests first in the early summer because it's the fruit, the fleshy part of the fruit is the big demander of potassium. And so as that fruit is really starting to expand in early summer, that's when we usually see this drawdown from the leaves and other parts of the system, which show these deficiencies. When things get worse, you might have some yellowing in addition to that curling. You might have some burn on the edges, like dead tissue on the edges. You'll see fruit set be decreased, shoot growth be decreased, leaf size be decreased, fruit size and color are reduced. And that reduction in fruit set and fruit size may manifest before you see very bad leaf symptoms. So before you even have a visual trigger of what's going on, it could be decreasing your yields. Severe potassium deficiency, we see this a lot in prunes because they demand a lot of potassium, which makes them very good for you to eat, but hard to farm. Can lead to limb dieback, and those smaller leaves let a lot of sunlight through, which increases the odds of having sunburn on your wood, which is then a way for other diseases to get into your wood and your limbs. So for peaches, and I would imagine you're in the same ballpark for the other stone fruit, we're looking at 4 to 5 pounds of K2O, or in terms of pure potassium, 3.3 to 4.2 pounds are removed with every ton of crop. So certainly when you're thinking about potassium inputs to your orchard, you want to be at least backfilling that use. But potassium is really sticky in the soil. It's very hard for trees to access for any plant roots. And so we usually talk about overshooting that by at least doubling the needs of the crop. So yeah, so potassium bound in these clay particles. So when you do apply it, I mean, so this is a synthetic application, but also it's a lot of potassium sources are mined. So I would imagine that's actually still quote unquote organic. Though like the environmental sustainability of it is questionable. So, but it moves with water, not nearly as fast as nitrate. So we try to concentrate it in these strips so that water will move it down and it will overwhelm the clay grabbiness in that zone so that some of that potassium will still be available to the roots to take it up. And this is on a, I think this orchard, yeah, had a movable pipe, so you don't even see an irrigation system in here. Oh no, there's a berm. They're flood irrigated. But if you have a drip irrigation system or a micro irrigation system, you want to make sure that you're concentrating the potassium under where that wetting zone is. So that's a soil applied approach. You can also kind of take out the middleman and go with potassium in a foliar application. That's more expensive, but it's a more direct approach. Okay, so again, the lab you send these leaf samples to can tell you about adequate and deficient zone, but there it is for your notes too. Oops. Okay, zinc. Zinc is the other thing that I've seen in a lot of fruit orchards, not quite being adequately met, the needs of that not being adequately met. Zinc is used for protein synthesis, in particular in the proteins involved in photosynthesis. So that's why we see yellowing as a result of not getting enough zinc. It's important for hormones. It's important for membrane integrity. The reason we often see zinc deficiencies is that the soil pH is high in our area. So zinc availability in the soil decreases once you get above 6.0 pH. So there's still zinc in that system, it's just not accessible to the plants. Organic matter can also lock up some of that zinc. So if you're working in a higher organic matter soil or adding a lot of organic matter to your soil, keep an eye on your zinc and how that responds. Cooler, wetter soils also lock up zinc. Different root stocks are better or worse at making that zinc then available from the soils, because roots create these root exudates to try to change the ecology in their zone a little bit. And some of them are good at making that soil more acidic so that that zinc is then released. Some of them are not as good at that. So what does this look like when we have zinc deficiency? You get this yellowing, you get between the veins of the leaves, yellowing in particular. When it gets really bad, we see much smaller leaves, pointy leaves in sort of stacked together. So the branch itself doesn't grow as much. And so everything's stacked together more tightly, and the leaves themselves are smaller. So we see that again here. And it actually looks a lot like Roundup damage if you've ever been subjected to that. The other thing that we'll often see is it'll be reflected in bloom behavior. So what you see on the bottom here is an adequate zinc prune orchard, and then on the top is a tree that didn't have enough zinc. And so you get a much wider bloom window of not all the flowers opening at the same time. So again, if you do apply some foliar zinc, that then gets in the way of getting a good lab sample. So we have a way of taking dormant shoot samples and looking at those for zinc as a way to get around that problem. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm happy to stay a little after the hour too, because I realize we're running long, is boron toxicity. So we see this in the Cache Creek watershed because that water source is very high in boron, and over many thousands of years has moved boron into our soils and our groundwater. When I went on, I've been on a couple of farm calls now with folks who had high boron in their stone fruit system, and it creates really interesting symptoms. So the fruit will color up early, the fruit fails to develop properly, and it has a really bitter taste, an unpleasant taste. So this is kind of what it looks like, an asynchrony and some fruit developing fast, some slow. This is very small fruit that's already beginning to color. And this is fruit that was dropping and had this sort of butt rot problem, similar to what you might see in tomatoes with low calcium. The reason is that boron in stone fruit piggybacks on sugar. And so you see it really build up in the sugar sinks of the tree, like growing tips and the fruit. So we get a high buildup of boron when there's too much in the system. We get that built up in the fruit, and that overwhelms the fruit, and the fruit doesn't like it. We also see, and it's not a great photo here, but you see this shoot that's a little blurry in the foreground that is dead most of the way down. We also, because the boron goes with the sugars to the growing tips of young branches, we get young branch dieback as well. So in a stone fruit system, at least, using a rootstock that has some almond in its background is one way to mitigate against this. It's just harder to manage in late season fruit because you have a whole season in which that boron can build up in the fruit. It's much easier. We don't see it as much in like apricots, early season stone fruit. And there are varietal differences. So definitely check with your neighbor about what varieties have worked for them in the past. I wanted to throw up just a couple of resources here. We used to have a stone fruit specialist, and before he left, he created this great website of fruit reports that I'll try to put the link in the chat, but you can also just Google fruit reports UC Cooperative Extension, should get you there. So the website is, it's not as flashy as new websites, but all the content is very good. And also the lab that Patricia is in created these fertilizer guidelines. So if you Google CDFA fertilizer guidelines or California fertilization guidelines, that can get you to some guidance on citrus, on peaches and nectarines, and on prunes and plums. Oh, and olives, because there's some olive folks on the call, and avocados for the avocado interested. So that is that was a real quick talk through of all that material. So I just want to open up for questions now if folks didn't understand anything, or if you've heard this and you're like, well, that sounds great, but how do I do that? This is a good time to talk about that.
Katherine, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.